Hello, welcome to AP Comparative Government. This is a pretty short lecture, so there's no note sheet that goes along with this one. Before getting into our first of our six countries, which is going to be Great Britain, we just want to remind ourselves that there's a distinction between the different types of governments that the course reviews. There's three kinds. There's advanced democracies, communist slash post-communist countries, and then there's developing slash less developed countries. We're going to be talking about Great Britain, and our only advanced democracy is Great Britain. The term itself, advanced democracy, tends to indicate a democracy which has been functioning for a long time. As I mentioned again, this is a very short lecture, so no note guide, just a quick intro. When we talk about advanced democracies, all advanced democracies have one thing in common. They must hold open, regular, and fair elections. Beyond that core principle, there are five characteristics that they all hold in common. The first is civil liberties. If you're in the United States, you might think of the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, so on and so forth. They all have what's called the rule of law, which means that there's this thing called due process, which means you can't be, for example, convicted of a crime unless the state has followed the prescribed process. And then there's also a neutral judiciary. You need different branches of government that have actual checks on each other. And a neutral judiciary, that is a judiciary or a judicial branch, which is not controlled by one of the other two branches or by like the military, that's an essential component of an advanced democracy. Another is what we call open civil society, which means essentially the ability to act independently, the ability to do things independent of what the government might want. A good example of this is independent mass media. So, if all the media in a nation is controlled by the government, then that nation does not enjoy open civil society. And the last one is kind of self explanatory, which is civilian military control, which means the civilians have control over the military. When the military has control over the government, you don't have an advanced democracy. End of sentence. The last thing that I want to point out is a term that's called social capital. I brought this up once before, but social capital is the amount of trust between the citizens and the government, the amount the citizens trust the government and the amount that the government trusts the citizens. The higher that number is, the more civil liberties you'll see, the more open civil society you will see, the more rule of law you will see, and the much more likely that it is that that country is an advanced democracy. So when you get a question on the test about advanced democracies, and specifically about Great Britain, or about what a country could do to become an advanced democracy, bringing up the idea of social capital as a means to the end be a very effective way of responding to the question. There's, of course, also just economic indicators of advanced democracies. Generally, advanced democracies like Great Britain are what we call post industrial. What that means is that they employ most of their population in what's called service or tertiary sectors. Service or tertiary sectors include things like education, healthcare, and information technology. These contrast with the most common type of job, which is created by industrialization. Industrialization or secondary sector jobs are things like factory jobs, building something, building a car, so on and so forth. Now, there's what's called the primary sector, which is the agricultural sector, so the production of foodstuffs. In any advanced democracy, the agricultural section is always going to be the smallest. The second to last thing that I have here is a chart that shows the breakdown in a couple of advanced democracies. So, what you'll notice right away is that the overwhelming number of people work in the service field, work in the tertiary field. So, again, things like healthcare, technologies, things like that. smaller in the industry, and almost no one in agriculture. These statistics come from 2020, as an aside. The final thing that I want to talk about, just to introduce, because we're going to be talking about Great Britain, is a supranational organization. A supranational organization is an organization that transcends national boundaries and which reduces the level of sovereignty of every nation under its control. These are also groups that tend to encourage cooperation amongst different nations. This has been one of the most important developments, at least over the past 2 decades, has been the growth of these international and supranational organizations. By far, of our 6 nations, if you are asked an essay question about a supranational organization, Great Britain makes the most sense to use to answer that question because they were, recently, a member of the EU. And Brexit and the EU is something that's going to come up on the test and something that's absolutely relevant. So Great Britain's relationship to the European Union, whose flag is there on the screen, is something worth looking into and addressing.